Folks, we're visiting today with John Halterman. He is the owner and founder of Beacon Wealth Management. John, thanks for being on the show today.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I'm excited.
Me too. I want to learn about you. I've seen you on social media. I want to learn more about you and your business.
We are a wealth management firm actually located here in West Virginia.
Yeah.
I started in the industry in 1994, and after 9/11, one thing I realized was that life could be super short.
Yes.
And that you really need to do something that you absolutely loved. And at that time, I was with a group of guys, and not that they were bad guys or anything like that, but they had a different vision for how we created the client experience.
Yeah.
And so 9/11, I thought, was the perfect opportunity to say, you know what, whatever you want to do in life, you got to get out and do it, the way you wanted to do it. And so right after 9/11, I started Beacon Wealth Management with the idea that, everything was going to be driven by the client experience, make it very highly engaging, make sure that we deeply cared, through a lot of touches. Because I think, the one thing with any business is it can be very institutionalized.
Yeah.
And I noticed in the financial world, that was very common. It was a very institutionalized thing. And I said, hey, look, we got to make this about the client, but it's got to be about that relationship and making sure that the client wins first. And so that was the concept. And then, of course, it was about team collaboration. In 1994, I started in the financial industry, just like a lot of people.
Yeah.
Got my securities license, got my insurance license, was going to be a financial advisor. And then, of course, I did that for almost 10 years. And then after 9/11, I started Beacon Wealth Management. And originally, it wasn't named Beacon Wealth Management. It was Beacon Financial. The wealth management came because I actually went to a class, and I met a guy by the name of Ted Rauderhuber. And so Ted was a estate planning, he was a trust officer attorney out of Atlanta. And he had talked about what they did in their trust department. And he talked about that wealth management was a higher version of financial planning. And so the more I got interested in that, or learning more about it, I got interested in it, and I started saying, okay, what's the difference? Well, what I learned was, they did things such as business succession planning.
Yes.
They did a lot of family governance stuff. They did a lot of stock option things. They did, they did a lot of advanced planning that was going beyond just the accumulation phase of investing. They specialized in working with retirees because income planning has become such a big deal because people don't have pensions anymore. And so it's not, it's easy to accumulate money and make mistakes early on when you're investing because you have time on your side. But when you're a retiree, how you invest is totally different than how you do it on the accumulation part. I was born in Vietnam.
Okay.
My dad was an Army soldier. My mom was a Vietnamese citizen.
Okay.
They met during the war. I always joke around because I always ask my dad, I said, how'd you have time to fight a war and have 3 kids? But somehow he did that. He had 3 kids in Vietnam. The opportunity, they got married. Said he wanted to come to the United States for, things. And so the irony is we got issued a birth certificate, citizenship, and boom, 1974, we're in West Virginia because that's his hometown.
Yeah.
And so Weston, West Virginia. So I was raised in Weston.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, what a great story. Thank you for sharing that. So, John, did you go to school to be a financial planner, to be in the financial industry?
Actually, did not originally.
Yeah.
So I grew up as a poor kid. Unfortunately, my mom and dad's story didn't work out. My dad had PTSD. And around the age of 10, 11, he decided that he was moving on. And so for the next 3, 4, 5 years, my mom and I and my brother and sister, we lived in poverty. My mom was working 2, 3 jobs. I became the lead of the family, had to start working, had responsibilities. And so I started learning things real quick, things I didn't want. And in fairness, my mom, because of struggle, and just trying to survive, she came home and said, hey, what'd you do today? She was constantly had expectations for me. And so I learned to have to work. And then when it came time to go to college, I'd asked my mom a few years earlier, I said, what have you thought about with college? And she says, as you know, I'm barely surviving on my own, let alone worried about you. And she goes, so really, at 18, you're going to have to make some of your own decisions. Wow. And so that's when I decided that, everybody in my family had served in the Army. And so I thought, you know what, maybe I should do the military to get my GI Bill. And so that's, I joined the Air Force is what I did.
Wow.
And so I went into the Air Force. I was an engineer in the Air Force. The irony is, my sergeant, my staff sergeant, says to me one day, he says, Halterman, he goes, you want to be a millionaire? And I was like, a millionaire? I'm like, guys like me, we're not millionaires. And he says, anybody can be a millionaire.
Wow.
And I was like, what are you talking about? So he said, do you know what compound interest was? And of course, I was naive. I had no idea. So he told me about compound interest. He says, as long as you have time on your side, and you do it systematically long enough, anybody can be a millionaire. Well, that fascinated me because in my mind, Elvis was a millionaire, so, so I knew I wasn't an entertainer. I wasn't an inventor. So I thought, wow, that means an ordinary person, that could just do ordinary things could become a millionaire. And so that's when I started getting fascinated in the financial world.
Wow. What age were you at that point?
I was probably about 19. Wow. Yeah, 19. And that's so amazing. I knew I was still going to be in the military doing my job, but I started wanting to learn about things. And so that was really the big thing was that, I started getting a curiosity. The irony is so I left the military. I wanted to come back to WVU to go to school, use my GI Bill. And but in between, I had a little bit of time on my side. And the irony is I read an ad in the I heard an ad on the radio about buying some life insurance. Yeah. And it didn't say life insurance. It was about college planning. Yeah. And so the guy said, hey, look, if you invest in college, this life insurance, he didn't say it was life insurance. He said, if you invest in this plan, you'll have enough to pay for college. And I'm like, how would you have enough putting $100 away a month to pay for college? But I did it thinking that, he's an expert. And what I quickly learned was, they weren't necessarily experts. They were salespeople. And I learned it was a life insurance policy. And it frustrated me because here I thought, what I learned from my staff sergeant in the military was the opposite. Because the one thing the military did really well at is they exposed you to financial advisors that would help you set up payroll deduction plans. And so my exposure then compared to what I got now was totally different. Wow. And so I was frustrated. The irony is the guy says to me, he goes, well, you seem to know a lot more about finances than your average 22-year-old. And I said, my staff sergeant introduced me. I'd worked with a guy saving some money. And I said, but I got to tell you, I consider you a thief. And he said, well, come into the business. He goes, if you think it's a problem, he goes, come into the financial world. If you can make a difference. And that kind of got my wheels a rolling, but I wasn't ready yet, But then a couple months later, I thought, maybe I should apply for a part-time job while I was waiting. And that's when I met Booker Walton out of Morgantown. Yeah. And so I met Booker. And he said, he goes, I'd love to have you join our firm, while you're in school.
Amazing.
Yeah, so that kind of kickstarted.
Did you finish your degree?
I did not actually. It's funny because working with Booker, he convinced me that, hey, look, you haven't gone to school yet completely, other than my military training and some classes. He goes, why don't you do this for a while? He goes, you seem to be, you care deeply. Yeah. So I did. And the irony is my very first client completely changed my life. My very first client was my sister. Wow. She called me up and she said, hey, look, she goes, I know you're in the financial business. We got a couple $100 a month. We got a 3-month-old baby. We'd like to do some college things. And I said, okay. I said, let's do it. Well, when we started talking, I said to her, I said, I'm not an expert at this point. I said, I'm in training. But I said, but the one thing they've said is I need to ask questions instead of just kind of taking orders, because if I was going to be a professional. And she said, well, what type of questions? And so I asked some basic questions about, what are you doing in terms of an emergency fund? If something were to happen to her husband, Jeff, what would her and Logan be left with? Just various questions that I knew to ask. And what I found during that process was that they had some other holes, in their finances. And so I had said to her, I said, instead of taking $200 a month and just putting it into a college plan, I said, why don't we do a few things? Why don't we start putting a little bit away in an emergency fund, put a little bit away, into a life insurance plan and this and that. And I said, because this way I think your needs would be covered better than just diving into this. Yeah. And I got to admit, I never once thought that anything would be needed except for the fact that one day her son would go to college. 6 months later, unfortunately, my brother-in-law got killed in an accident.
Oh, my goodness.
And I remember getting that call from my mom saying, hey, look, you got to come home. And I said, why? And she goes, there's been a situation happen. Well, I went home and I saw my mom and my sister crying. And my sister came up to me. She goes, you're not going to believe. She goes, Jeff got killed today, or yesterday. And I was like, what are you talking about? Because now my nephew was only 9 months old. And so the strangest feeling came in my life. The feeling of, I said to myself, not only did she lose her husband and she lost, their income, but also I was part responsible, because I played a professional role. And I started thinking, oh my gosh, did I do the right thing? And I realized right then and there the difference between being a salesperson versus a professional. Because a salesperson would have been glad to just take the order. But as a professional advisor, you got to get to know the client and figure out, what's their true needs. The irony is my very first client completely changed my life. My very first client was my sister.
Wow. She
called me up and she said, hey, look, she goes, I know you're in the financial business. We got a couple $100 a month. We got a 3-month-old baby. We'd like to do some college things. And I said, okay. I said, let's do it. Well, when we started talking, I said to her, I said, I'm not an expert at this point. I said, I'm in training. But I said, but the one thing they've said is I need to ask questions instead of just kind of taking orders, because if I was going to be a professional. And she said, well, what type of questions? And so I asked some basic questions about, what are you doing in terms of an emergency fund? If something were to happen to her husband, Jeff, what would her and Logan be left with? Just various questions that I knew to ask. Yeah. And what I found during that process was that they had some other holes, in their finances. And so I had said to her, I said, instead of taking $200 a month and just putting it into a college plan, I said, why don't we do a few things? Why don't we start putting a little bit away in an emergency fund, put a little bit away, into a life insurance plan and this and that. And I said, because this way I think your needs would be covered better than just diving into this. And I got to admit, I never once thought that anything would be needed except for the fact that one day her son would go to college. 6 months later, unfortunately, my brother-in-law got killed in an accident.
Oh, my goodness.
And I remember getting that call from my mom saying, hey, look, you got to come home. And I said, why? And she goes, there's been a situation happen. Well, I went home and I saw my mom and my sister crying. And my sister came up to me. She goes, you're not going to believe. She goes, Jeff got killed today, or yesterday. And I was like, what are you talking about? Because now my nephew was only 9 months old. And so the strangest feeling came in my life. The feeling of, I said to myself, not only did she lose her husband and she lost, their income, but also I was part responsible, because I played a professional role. And I started thinking, oh my gosh, did I do the right thing? And I realized right then and there the difference between being a salesperson versus a professional. Because a salesperson would have been glad to just take the order. But as a professional advisor, you got to get to know the client and figure out, what's their true needs. Because, clients come to you for a reason.
Yeah. So the question that comes to mind is that did she have the life insurance in place?
She did.
So
Luckily,
she had a safety net.
Yeah, so she had the safety net because, I knew that it was important. One of the questions I asked was, if something happens, what does that mean for you all? How can you survive? How much income do you need? Do you have to pay off? So we had enough there.
Yeah.
And so that stunned me. I mean, that truly
changed your life,
changed my life.
Well, John, I appreciate you sharing that story. And I also want to take a moment to thank you for your military service.
Well, thank you.
Anytime I have a veteran on the show, I want to make sure that I pay homage to that. This is Positively West Virginia. We'll be right back.
Your prescriptions are designed to keep you healthy, active, full of life. At Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield, we're making vital medicine more affordable. Because when your prescriptions don't cost an arm and a leg, you can use those limbs for something more meaningful. Because life. Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield, West Virginia.
Folks, we're visiting once again with John Halterman. He is the owner of Beacon Wealth Management in Harrison County, West Virginia. John, I want to tell you or ask you a little bit about the specific things that you're talking about today in your business. Like, what are the things that you're known for? Is it the the business succession planning? Is it tax prep? I mean, talk a little bit.
Yeah,
about,
so
what
we
are the
work.
specific.
We're
things?
really a niche boutique.
Yeah.
When I say a niche boutique, we primarily work with people in the second half of their life.
Yes.
We call them responsible savers.
Yeah.
We work with entrepreneurs, people who have small businesses, and we work with a lot of executives, or professionals. And so a lot of people that are doctors, lawyers, accountants,
Yeah.
very common small business owners,
Yeah.
but a lot of people that are getting ready to pre-retirees that, like, two of them may have worked at the FBI, or they may have worked at WVU, or they may have worked for an energy company.
Yes.
Because, the thing that a lot of people are facing that's so different than when I came into the business.
Mm-hmm.
When I came into the business, people still had pensions.
Yeah.
Retirement wasn't as big of a deal because, number one, people didn't live as long, and they didn't have to have an other income source.
Yeah.
And so what I realized early on was that I went and got a lot of training. And I got training. I got certified as a certified wealth strategist. I became a certified estate planner, an accredited investment fiduciary. And so a lot of my training became unique and specialized for people that were highly successful and also people that were in the second half of their life. Because what the unique challenges are is that when you're taking income from a portfolio, and let's say we have a 2008, well, unfortunately, that changes the game because if the markets go down 50% and you're taking income out of it, well, you may not get the same recovery. Yeah. And so what a person taking income does versus a person accumulating money should be totally different. Mm-hmm. And because of the fact that someone that's in the accumulation phase, they have time to recover, they can make more mistakes. Yeah. My clients, they're super, super dependent on this income because this income ultimately dictates their lifestyle. Sure. And so the other thing that we do other than retirement income planning is tax planning. For people, the more taxes you pay, the less money you have to live off of. Right. And so one of the big things is that the more we can save you in taxes, the more net income that you're going to get. The first step in our process is what we consider to be our base camp. And in base camp, we want to get you organized. Mm-hmm. And as an example, we had a person come in just recently. They inherited all this money. They had no idea how much they had, no idea where it was at. But what we found was they had about 50 different accounts. And so the first thing we did was we got all this organized into one portal so they could see everything they had. And this person was absolutely stunned because they had no idea because they had all these 50 different statements. And so getting people organized so they can see a big snapshot is a big deal. Yeah. Then from there, we wanted to gain, clarity on their vision. Because for most people, we call it the financial summit. Everyone's financial summit's going to be totally different.
Sure. Yeah.
And then
the next called personal finance.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And then the next thing is we got to get clarity on challenges because not everyone's aware of the things that you need to do.
Yeah.
And so if we agree at that point that, hey, look, this makes sense. Now they get to see a snapshot. Now we know where we're going. The next step is putting together a focus on them, and usually them and their spouse. And what I say about that goes into the retirement income strategy and their taxes. Then from there, what we do in our next step, we call it the outlook session, is now we're going to elaborate on their family. Because, we know that, hey, they're taking care of themselves. We've elevated their lifestyle. We've reduced their taxes. But what happens if one of you're gone? Yeah. What happens for your children? Yeah. Because like myself, I have 3 children. And my children are young. And, what I always ask people is, once you're gone, okay, what do you want to happen for your children? Do you want them just to get the money straight out and just spend it? Do you want to get it on a graduated basis where they get it over a period of time? Or would you like to create a perpetual income for them for the rest of their life? Because depending on how you do that, is really going to depend on how you set up your estate,
Yeah.
and do you have any gifting things you're concerned about? Sure. And what happens if you become incapacitated? What happens if you become or end up in a nursing home? And so that's the next step of our process. And then the last step of our process, which is not applicable to everybody, but if you own a business, you got a whole new set of work.
A whole other layer.
Yeah, man, that's a whole other level. Because what most people don't realize is most businesses don't end successfully. They end in disaster. 76% of all businesses actually end in disaster. And when I say this, it's either a death, a disability, something or a financial disaster. It doesn't, so I see people all the time that are highly successful. And they think, oh, you know what? When I get out here at the end, I'm just going to sell my business. I'm going to sell my equipment. And what they find is what they think may be worth $5, $10, $20 million, nobody wants to buy it. Yeah. Because no one's going to buy 20-year-old construction equipment. No one's going to buy things that they made money with and made great income.
Yeah.
But people aren't going to give you that value.
That's right.
And so you got to have a succession plan. If you're a executive, a lot of times you get extra bonuses. Well, you got to figure out, how do these executive benefits turn into income? Yeah. If you own real estate property and you're trying to get out of it, and now you got to say, okay, well, how do I? Because when you're younger, you don't mind the maintenance of real estate, but then when you get older, you're thinking, wait a minute, I own 30 properties. How am I going to maintain this? Do I want to be a part of that? So a lot of times people say, how do I convert that to an income benefit, but not lose out on big taxes?
As we close out our time, how can listeners learn more about Beacon Wealth Management? Is there a way for them to even
Absolutely. So
contact you?
Easiest way is either to go to our website, which is bwmwv.com. That's our website. Yep. We have all the social medias like everybody, so we have Facebook, we have YouTube, we have LinkedIn and all those things. Yep. Of course, you can always call our office. Yep. It's 304-626-3900.
Yeah, that's great, John. And we will make sure we have links to all that in the show notes and on our social media, so folks can absolutely reach out and get in touch with you. Our guest once again has been John Halterman with Beacon Wealth Management. John, it's been an honor to have you on the show. Again, thank you for your military service. I just think that what you're doing, your heart and your mindset around wealth management and helping people and showing your clients and exposing them to these adventures in West Virginia is really amazing, and I love that. And I just want to encourage you to keep up the great work.
Oh, well, thank you. It was an honor to be here. I mean, I love your program. It's really ironic. The books, the podcast, some of the same language we talk. So so much alike.
Yeah, we're connected for sure.
Yeah. So definitely
awesome.
Great stuff.
Yeah, it was great to meet you. Again, John Halterman with Beacon Wealth Management.